This week's Torah portion of Korach is the most familiar portion for anybody who works in Jewish community affairs. Because as we know, unfortunately, the idea of there being a machloket, a dispute, competing interests, competing parties, competing viewpoints, it is the one constant of Jewish life. And we know how destructive it is, just as it proves in this week's Torah reading, to also be very destructive. And as I like to say, it's Korach is like theater and a play, in that whenever a dispute erupts, it seems as though every one of the roles becomes played and fulfilled by different people in the community. It really is a script. How people gather together, how they influence one another, how some people drop off, other people join in. That's what we're going to look at. And this class is completely based on a presentation made by Rabbi Yitzhak Breitowitz, which is very intriguing. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but we're going to give it a shot this evening because I think it's really very exciting. Let's look at the narrative. And the Parsha of Korach begins in chapter 16 in the book of Numbers. And according to Nachmanides, it's important to note that it was only once it was decreed that the entire nation was going to die in the wilderness and that they weren't going to enter the land. That created a certain vulnerability to dispute and machloket and to the unity of the Jewish people falling to pieces, and someone even being able to take on the leadership of Moshe as Korach did. Because the people were in shock. They were down. They were despairing. They had just found out that due to their acceptance of the report of the spies and their bemoaning the fact that they would never enter the land, God in fact decreed on them that they wouldn't enter the land. They would die in the wilderness. And rather than seeing it, here's an opportunity for us to build up the Jewish people. 40 years in the wilderness will re-establish unity and connection and depth of understanding and attachment to Torah. Instead, they despaired. And when people are despairing, we know that's when hatred and divisiveness can most easily take root. So the story is Korach, a tremendously distinguished member of the Jewish people, a person who is described by many as having greatness that in some ways exceeded the greatness of Moshe, leads a rebellion, gathers 250 members of the tribe of Ruvain, stands up and attacks the leadership of Moshe. And he does so with the following words, and this is chapter 16, and it's sentence 3. And he leads a gathering and he says, "It is too much for you," meaning you, Moshe, are usurping the power. You're becoming an autocrat. For the entire assembly, all of them are holy, and Hashem is among them. Why do you exalt yourselves over the congregation of Hashem, pointing to the fact that you are the leader and your brother Aaron is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. It's a power grab. You're taking it all for yourself. Moshe responds, and you look ahead to sentence 8. Hear now, O offspring of Levi, because he was a member of the same tribe. Is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has segregated you from the assembly of Israel to draw you near to himself, to perform the service at the tabernacle of Hashem and stand before the assembly to minister them? He drew you near, all the tribe of Levi. Therefore, you and your entire assembly that are joining together are in fact against Hashem. And as for Aaron, what is it that you protest against him? Aaron didn't elect himself or choose himself to be the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. God bestowed that position upon him, placed that responsibility upon him, and he's assumed that responsibility. Now, what's very clear here is that the two conversations completely miss each other. Korach is coming forward with a very high-minded decentralization, whatever you want to say. We all are great. We don't need a leader. God's spoken to all of us. We all stood at Sinai. We don't need a family to rule over us. And Moshe basically answers and says, how can you be so jealous? How can you be smitten by a desire for power and to rule? You have an important place in the community already. Why are you grabbing more? Now, I don't want to discuss politics here, but we all know that in the great revolutions of history, the ones we're most familiar with, it's always the downtrodden rising up and then becoming oftentimes or all the time more autocratic, more harsh than the government that they have overthrown. And that's just the history of the world. But what's interesting here is that Moshe is clear in approaching Korach, a great man, and saying, you have a hidden agenda. You are not being honest. You are not concerned that the position I hold as the leader of the Jewish people, like the king, as if I'm a king, which is the way it's described by some of the rabbis, and Aaron's position as the Kohen Gadol, you're not really concerned that we're thwarting the individual growth and sanctity and holiness of every individual. You're jealous and you want to rule yourself and you want to take this for yourself. So Moshe is this exposing a hidden agenda. And that's what this whole thing is about. We discussed this last week in an interesting way, that sometimes subconsciously motivations rule over us and we're not that aware of it, and then they sublimate themselves into ideologies that can sound very lofty and very high-minded. And that's what we see all day today in our world. We see any idea being advocated because there's no moral underpinning, and anything I can attach an argument to, that's what prevails. And that was the idea of propaganda. You know, I always thought of propaganda as just throw out lies and people will believe them. But the truth is, it's not really what propaganda is about. Propaganda is appeal to some subconscious motivation within people and run that by them to the nth degree, and it'll push aside all reasonableness, all balance, all thoughtfulness, and therefore you just grab the people. And I want to tell a story in this regard. It's a story that I heard from our Rosh Yeshiva, and when yeshivas were being started, circa 1900 in Europe, the strongest yeshiva in the world at that time was in Slobodka, and it was known for having great leaders. And very often, if a town wanted to start a yeshiva, they had a Rav or a Rosh Yeshiva in the town, and they would summon some students from Slobodka to come and give them a year or two of their study and their leadership to establish the yeshiva, and then they would go back. So once such an occurrence happened, and there happened to be that the founder of the new yeshiva was not into Musar, into the analysis of human motivation. So it happened to be the week of the reading of the Parsha of Korach, and it was Friday night, and this group of 4 or 5 students that had come from the Slobodka yeshiva that were very tuned into what we call Musar, plumbing the depths of human motivation. They were having a big debate. Was Korach motivated by this? Was he motivated by that? What about the 250 people who joined him? What about Dasan V'Yavir? And what about all the different conspirators? What was on their mind? And they were doing deep analysis based on statements of the rabbis. And this Rosh Yeshiva came in, sat down, listened to him for a while, and he stood up and he banged on the table and said, what are you people hacking about? What are you talking about so much? Korach was evil, he was evil, he was evil. That's all we need to know. Don't spend your time like this. Go back and study Talmud. And it was an interesting clash in terms of illuminating what the whole endeavor of Musar introspection, self-analysis, the kind of study that it engenders. And the truth is there were great people who didn't subscribe to it, and they were great in any event in terms of Torah and in terms of self-understanding. But the consensus has been recently that we need Musar to really arrive at a place. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention to the classical Mishnah, which discusses this. I'm going to share the screen for a moment as soon as I can. Okay, I hope everybody can see this. If you can't, unmute yourself and tell me. But this is Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah 17, and we'll do it in English. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? Such is the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. And which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and his congregation. That's the Mishnah. So we're dealing here with a classical disputation. And I just want to comment on this Mishnah because I think it's presenting a very important idea. Very often when people study Talmud, they say, what do I need? This opinion, that opinion, this one holds this one holds that. Get to the chase. Let me learn the halacha. Let me know what the conclusion is. So it's so interesting that we define a dispute between Hillel and Shammai, which there were relatively few, but then their students had many disputes, as being l'shem shamayim, because the Mishnah always quotes the opinion of Shammai first, and then it quotes the opinion of Hillel or Beis Hillel. And it's interesting to note that oftentimes the opinion of Beis Hillel is the more lenient, almost all the time. Now, people get frustrated. What do I need all this for? But the answer is because each perspective, although different, although coming to opposite conclusions, sheds light and gives understanding for everyone. And it's important. And we even have a comment from the sages that says, although overwhelmingly the law, the Jewish law, the halacha, follows the opinion of Shammai and Beit Shammai, in the future, when it'll be Messianic times, it'll switch, and it'll be the opinion of Beis Shammai, of Shammai's students, who will carry the day. Surprising thing, because it says, what is truth? What is truth all about? We're going to get to that. But in the meantime, let's understand that when properly motivated, sincere people take on different perspectives and viewpoints and opinions, and they're coming from a good place, each one has something important to say. Each one merits consideration. Each one needs to be given thought to because it has a lasting, permanent future. But then it goes on and says, what's a dispute that's not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregants, his congregation. This is not a dispute that merits consideration. Very famously, one of the commentaries say, shouldn't have said this is the controversy of Korach and Moshe, or Moshe and Korach. And the answer is that, one of the answers given is that, in fact, every member of this rebellion had their own viewpoint, had their own axe to grind, had their own perspective to take. And therefore, it wasn't only an argument between Korach and his followers to Moshe. In fact, every single one of them had their own hidden agenda and their own things perking within them and their own issues that they wanted to, their own jealousies, their own petty viewpoints, their own understanding of why I'm not getting my due and I don't have an important enough place and why I'm being overlooked and why maybe there's really truth in the fact that Moshe is not acting according to God's command, but he's rather acting on his own. So this Mishnah sheds this important light that there are perspectives that are not the accepted wisdom, but yet have enduring importance, and perhaps even a time when they will be the accepted as the ultimate truth and wisdom, although not now, such as the case of Shammai and Hillel, and Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. And then there are disputes that are petty and with an agenda which is despicable and evil and wrong. And of course, what's commended here is that each of us, especially when we're disputing with someone, especially when we're in an argument, especially when we have a viewpoint different than someone else's, each of us have the responsibility to look within ourselves, check our motivation, purify our motivation, see to it that we're acting for the sake of heaven. And if we truly are, then all the viewpoints ultimately will find that they prevail. It's not a simple idea to wrap your head around, but this is posited by the Talmud clearly. when it says Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, that in the disputes in the Talmud, when one person says it's permitted and one person says it's not permitted, one person says this is a mitzvah to do it like this, and the other one says no, that's not the mitzvah, do it like this. They each have tremendous truth and validity to them. And even if we accept ultimately one view over the other, we should study both to give us a fuller, more clear understanding of what reality, what truth, what Hashem's will really is in the world. So now we're going to get to something that's very shocking. And that's the direction of this class here. In the Kabbalistic sources, and here this is all quoted in the name of the Arizal. The Ari, of course, is the ultimate Kabbalist who appeared out of the blue in the city of Tzvat. And he, at the same time that Rabbi Yosef Cairo was there completing the Shulchan Aruch, at the same time there was a whole group of major Kabbalists and halachic rabbis all together. And he burst on the scene as being recognized as the most holy, final authority, and he revamped many ideas about Judaism from a Kabbalistic perspective. So he says something shocking. If you look at Psalm 92, and that's the quote here in the middle toward the top of this page. Psalm 92 is the psalm we sing on Shabbat. And the end of it is talking about a vision for the future. And it says the words are tzaddik katamor yifroch. A righteous person, like a date palm, will flourish. And what the Ari points out is that if you take the last letter of each of those three words, tzaddik, katamor, yifroch, it spells the name of Korach, Kuf, Reish, Chet. And therefore the Ari also says that it's the last letter in the name. So what does that mean, that it's the last letter in the name? It means that just as we said about the opinion in halacha, whether it's like Shammai or Hillel, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, he says that in the end of time, Korach will reemerge and take a rightful place amongst the Jewish people. And it's a shocking thought to have, because after all, in the essence here, Korach was disputing the divine directive that Moshe should lead the Jewish people and that his brother Aaron should be the Kohen Gadol. And that's indisputable. That can't be doubted for a moment. So what it means, though, is that there's a certain validation to the notion that no leadership should impede the individual greatness that people pursue. Of course, not in a competitive way, not in the sense of vying for office or rulership, but in other words, any leader of the Jewish people who is entrusted with guiding the flock of the Jewish people through history and being the leader, people like Yoshua, who succeeds Moshe, King David, Shaul, who didn't do his job the way he should have as the first king and therefore was removed, those people have a tremendous obligation to lead, and they also have an obligation to make allowances for the individual growth of everybody else. So here's where we get this conundrum. We're going to move from this idea with the following thought. What's really unusual about this dispute is the way that it gets settled. If you look back in the Torah in chapter 16 here, Moshe sets up a duel between the 250 people bringing their incense and Aaron bringing his incense. And then Moshe says something very uncharacteristically. Moshe says, Moshe basically, and we'll find the sentences here. Maybe Frank will find it for us. Moshe says to Hashem, I insist that these people not die in a normal way, and that the earth should swallow them up. the idea of what was going to take place is put forward from Moshe. And of course, this is the antithesis of Moshe's leadership throughout all the time that he leads the Jewish people, where he's constantly praying on their behalf. He's interceding between man and God when they worship the calf with the sin of the spies. He's praying on their behalf. Here we see Moshe acting uncharacteristically.
Rabbi, it's page 827, verse 28.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And it's good, and we'll read it quickly. Moshe says, "Through this shall you know that Hashem sent me to perform all these acts, that it was not from my heart. If these people die the death of all men, and the destiny of all men is visited upon them, then it is not Hashem who has sent me. But if Hashem will create a phenomenon, and the ground will open its mouth and swallow them, and all that is theirs, and they will descend alive to the pit, then you shall know that these men have provoked Hashem." And in fact, that's what happens. That is what takes place here. Thank you very much. Totally, Moshe seemingly stepping out of character. So let me challenge everybody here. This idea of the earth swallowing something up, does it ring a bell with anybody with any other place? And think about the book of Genesis. And we won't think about the Garden of Eden. I don't want to mislead you because I know we're always going back to there. Is there an event in the book of Genesis which speaks along these lines? Any suggestions? So the answer is, if you look in chapter 4 in Genesis, when Cain kills Hevel, the Torah goes out of its way to say his blood is crying out from the earth. And there's chapters in Psalms that talk about the earth wrapping itself around the dead Hevel and absorbing him, the first person to be murdered in the world, first person to die in the world. The earth takes him in. Let's look at something here. And this is going to require some insightful thinking. And it is a Kabbalistic notion. The Kabbalistic notion, as we're going to see borne out in subtleties in the text, is that Adam was an all-encompassing creature of God. In other words, he was God's handiwork, and I'm not saying to the exclusion of his wife, but Adam was created in harmony and balance with God's own hands. They get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. We're not talking about that tonight. What happens next? They have 2 children. And let's look at these sentences in chapter 4. When it talks about Cain being born, I only have the Hebrew here. I'm sorry, I don't have the English also. And Frank, if you could just take a look at chapter 4, you'll see where this is. It's right toward the beginning of it. It says that they've left the Garden of Eden, and Chava, Eve, the mother of all mankind, becomes pregnant and has a child. She calls him Cain, Vatomer, and she says, Chaniti ish et Hashem, which is usually translated as I have acquired a human being with God. But the word Chaniti also has the implication I've created a human being. Okay, so this is a grand description of her child. In other words, Chava, after leaving the Garden of Eden, is thrilled with her woman's capacity, together with her husband, to bring a child into the world and to perpetuate human existence. And so she says, this is our creation. We've created a human being. She's enthralled by that idea. And what she's doing there is investing Cain with a tremendous sense of grandeur. So she's saying there's Adam, the first man, and according to some opinions, she's part of that first creation. Others, she's from his rib, but in any event, she's part and parcel of it, created by God's direct handiwork. And now, as a human being, I have created a human being. And she's enthralled by that idea. And she's enthralled by the idea of, look, we have produced also a being created in the image of God. So Cain becomes this inflated, great hope for the future.
Rabbi, would you like me to read the English translation of that?
Yes, please. And just what sentence is it, please?
It's verse 8 on
Thank
page
you.
21. Cain spoke with his brother Hevel, and it happened when they were in the field that Cain rose up against his brother Hevel and killed him.
That's the next quote here. But let's first look at the birth of the two boys, just before that, right in the beginning. Because then after she gives birth to Cain and gives him this grand name, Vatosef Oledet, she has another child, Esachiv, a brother, at Hevel, and he's called Hevel. What does Hevel mean? We know the word Hevel from the book of Kohelet. Hevel Havolim Hakol Hevel, vanity of vanities. And vanity, although, we think of being vain as being someone who's into self-aggrandizement, the real word vanity, as Rabbi Bradowitz traces out for us, is vain. It's futile. It has no great value. So here we get this immense disparity between these two children. She gives birth to the first child, and she says, wow, here is a world beater, the first humanly produced human being, also created in the image of God. And she has, here's Hevel. He's like breath, fleeting, frail, fragile. After all, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. There's going to be death in the world. Human beings are frail and fragile. Huge disparity between the two. So, and then what happens is what Frank did just read to us. There's a little in-between story. This Cain, who is enamored by his name with being created in the image of God with a certain strength and power, he undertakes something amazing. He's going to bring an offering to God. And he takes from the fruit that he's grown, not from the best, and he approaches God with an offering. An earth-shattering thing to do, but a way of a human being saying, I am created in the image of God, so God can be worshipped by me. I can bring my tomatoes and my pomegranate and my figs and my grapes, and I can offer them to God because I am the highest creation in the world, and I want to attach myself to God. Lo and behold, his offering is rejected. Hevel, the one who's more fleeting, futile, quiet, diminished, humble, sees what his brother's doing, takes to heart this idea that, wow, as a human being, I also can attach myself to God. I'm going to do it with the nature that's imbued with me, which is one of humility and a sense of my own vulnerability as a person. I'm going to take the best that I have, and I'm going to offer it to God. And lo and behold, his offering is accepted. So look what we have here. We have Cain breaking new ground and worshiping God, approaching God directly, an audacious thing to do. But as a human being wanting to connect to God unsuccessfully. And then we have Hevel, this diminutive, humble person, saying, wow, that's a magnificent example. Let me take from the best of my flock. Let me make an offering to God. And lo and behold, his is accepted. Cain gets very infuriated. God tries to calm him down and says, look, you'll do it again. We have a long history here. And now we're up to the part that you were reading. They find themselves in the field. Vayokam Cain el Hevel achi vayargehu. And Cain, the mighty one, the one imbued with image of God, doesn't say what happened. He rises up on Hevel and he murders him. And again, whether there's a lot of questions here in terms of how this works, but Hevel becomes eliminated. And ultimately, Cain becomes an outcast. And then we have another child born to Adam and Eve, and that child becomes the progenitor of really the human race. Although it gets disrupted at the time of Noah, but that's the story. So what we see here is something quite astounding, because this is where a concept of Gilgal, a concept of you can call it reincarnation, which it is, but a concept that future souls are born of souls that came before. So here's what the story is. Let's talk about Moshe for a moment, okay? What do we know about Moshe? What's Moshe's most salient feature? How is he praised by the Torah? Who wants to contribute that? Moshe is called what?
The most humble man in the world.
Anov Mikol Adam, the most humble person. So where does Moshe derive his soul from, so to speak? He derives his soul as a descendant of Hevel. And we know Moshe's story. First of all, he rises up and kills the Egyptian, an audacious thing to do. He does it to save a fellow Jew and to protest the subservience going on. Then he disappears. He encounters God at the burning bush, and God says, come, you're going to be the leader. You're going to take the Jewish people. I said, you kidding me? Go find somebody else. Get my brother. He's a much more of a leader. I can't even speak. All those things we're familiar with. So Moshe is the reluctant leader of the Jewish people who's rooted in the soul of Hevel, but yet out of responsibility, with a sense of purity and obligation to serve God and to help mankind, Moshe accepts leadership to a tremendous extent. Last week, he says to God, it's too much for me. I need to create elders. I need to share the leadership. It's too great of a burden. But Moshe spends his entire life standing up and in a certain sense, transcending his inner humility for the sake of God and for the sake of God's plan for the world of developing the Jewish people. That's Moshe, rooted in Hevel. Who is Korach? Korach is a person of immense greatness. We already said that. But Korach lacks that rooting in the humility and frailty of human beings. Korach is pure Kayin, so to speak. He has that sense that I am great and I'm aware of my greatness, and therefore I can be an initiator of great things like Kayin was in approaching God. I can come up with new ideas. I can be a much greater leader than a Moshe can. But of course, lacking humility, these sub-agendas, these personal agendas naturally take hold, because the only way they can be avoided is with the ultimate sense of humility and humbleness and a sense of appreciation that I want to do everything for the sake of heaven and not for my own sake. So hence, we have in this week a clash between the descendant of Hevel, who was murdered in the beginning of human history, and the descendant of Cain, who committed a murder, not because he was a murderer, but because he couldn't accept the idea of being diminished in front of his brother. He couldn't handle the idea that here I brought the first offering and it was rejected, and now God has accepted his offering. That was something he couldn't live with. So now what do we have here? We have an ultimate rectification. And Moshe, not having sub-agendas, Moshe sees this with clarity. Moshe sees that if only a Korach can accept the leadership of a humble Moshe, be great, just as you espoused at the beginning of the Torah portion. You are holy. You did stand at Sinai. You did see the miracles of Egypt. Become great and close to God, but don't make it a power grab or an attention grab or put yourself at the center of the stage. Remain subject to the humble leadership of a Moshe, and then all will be in order. Korach couldn't do that. So what happens to Korach? What happens to Korach is what happened to Hevel. The earth has to swallow him up whole and absorb him, because that greatness is not going to produce anything good, because it doesn't have that rooting in humble clarity of conviction that all that I do is for the sake of God, and that's what makes it worthwhile. And that if greatness comes my way, that's what'll happen. I want to show you, here's the razzle dazzle at the end. If you look at the bottom here, I hope you can see this. Moshe's name, the numerical value of Mem, Shin, He, is 345. Korach's name, Kuf Resh Chet, has a numerical value of 308. Hevel, the humble one, his name has the value of 37. To the extent that a human being can take 37 sincere humility and then combine that with the qualities of a Korach, of a sense of him being imbued with the great potential human beings have to serve God, to lead the world, to open the world's eyes to greatness, then you add the two together and you get a Moshe, a number 345. Do you see the concept here of adding them two together? Moshe was able to perfectly synthesize and harmonize these two aspects of life. And therefore, Moshe needed to prevail. And Korach, who's this echo of greatness lacking humility, Moshe has to stand before God and man and say, we need the earth to swallow him up, because that will rectify the ultimate origin of human history, when the earth was forced to swallow up the body of Hevel, of this humble servant of God, in light of the being overwhelmed by the aggrandizement of a truly great person. So this is where we have a cosmic story. This is where we have something for us to think about. Now you can characterize this, the famous quote from the Kutzker Rebbe that a person has to have two pockets. In one pocket it says, for me the universe was created, I was created in the image of God. And in the other pocket he has to have a saying that says, Anochi ofor v'efer, I'm like dust and ashes. I'm, with sense of humility. How a person combines this, when they combine it, we have to most especially be able to look within ourselves, to parse our own motivations, to work over the course of a lifetime to become more sincerely motivated, to become less self-centered, to become more interested in what is God's will, what is the truth here, what is the right way to do it. And even if that means that no one is ever going to hear about me, or it means that I'm going to be third in command, or fourth in command, or fifth in command, exactly where Korach fits in. If you can manage that, then you have a place throughout the history of the Jewish people. And that's where we get back to this notion, this Kabbalistic notion of the Arizal, going back here to the sentence in Psalm 92. Tzaddik katamor yifroch. Korach ultimately fell short. He's a tragic figure in the most classical sense of what tragedy is all about. But he represented an ideal of human beings striving as an individual to become as great as they possibly can. It wasn't tempered. It wasn't balanced. So therefore, it was eliminated from the world. But the Arizal, in his ultimate understanding of the nature of the souls of people, said there'll be a future time. The Jewish people need that sense of being imbued with their inner greatness also. It has to be maintained throughout Jewish history. It can't be forgotten. Humility is the bedrock upon which greatness and service to Hashem can be born. But it also requires a sense of taking on the world in the sense of I'm created in the image of God. I have a lot to accomplish. I have a lot to achieve. I have a tremendous amount of potential. And that's what we have from this Parsha. What we have in this Parsha is an immensely tragic chapter in the history of the Jewish people. Korach becomes eliminated from the future course of Jewish history. And actually, there's a fanciful Kabbalistic Gemara that says there was a little hole in the ground in the desert, and once a year, a certain Talmudic scholar would go and he would put his ear to the ground and he would hear Korach proclaiming, Moshe Emet v'Torato Emet. Korach was forever screaming out, Moshe is a man of truth, and the Torah that he taught us is truth. And you know that by looking at my life and looking at the tragedy of my life. And even if there were aspects of greatness that I superseded Moshe in, it's clear that it was ordained by God that he would be, just as God explained to him at the burning bush, he, rooted in his humility, would be the leader to face all the challenges of life and lead the Jewish people to the border of the promised land. That's the way history was meant to work. Korach becomes the tragic figure that teaches us that, and that pushes us back to the early story of Cain and Abel and gives us a whole perspective and understanding that our souls also echo these original souls of people. And we have to cherish our greatness, and we have to temper it with humility. And we have to understand that maybe the world isn't giving me the due that I think it should, but I know that I am, as an individual and as a part of a community, doing my utmost to act as a person created in the image of God and to do so with humility. That's the example Moshe lays out for us. That's the example we aspire to. And we need to take these balance and these different elements within ourselves. We need to learn to be able to look within ourselves, understand ourselves with clarity, and then great things happen. Society makes progress, harmony prevails, and we can have a Jewish people truly living up to the goal of being a light unto the nations and fulfilling in our own daily living all of God's plans for the world. Any questions?